Hello everyone. In this session, we are going to learn how to configure Microsoft Distributed File System Replication Service, or commonly known as DFSR, with AWS Directory Service. AWS Directory Service offers several directory offerings, and one of them is Microsoft Active Directory. The Microsoft Active Directory that you get with AWS Directory Service is a managed version of Microsoft Active Directory, so AWS take care of patching and maintenance. My name is Sriwant Attanayaka and I'm a partner solution architect at Amazon Web Services. So what's the agenda for today? I'm going to give you a quick high-level architecture to give you an idea around the infrastructure that we are going to put on. Then I'm going to showcase you how to configure the network. I will then go into configuring the AWS Directory Service to create a managed version of Microsoft Active Directory. I'll then spin up a few EC2 instances and then configure the Distributed File System Replication Service. And finally, once I have completed all the configuration, I'm going to showcase you a testing scenario where I'm going to replicate a file across multiple servers. So let's get started. What's the high-level architecture that we are going to create in this session? I'm going to create Amazon Virtual Private Cloud in the CIDR block 10.0.0.0.16, and in 3 availability zones, I'm going to create 5 subnets, 2 private subnets and 3 public subnets. In the 2 private subnets, I'm going to set up AWS Directory Service. So the domain controller 1 and domain controller 2 will be in 2 private subnets. And in the public subnets, I'm going to create EC2 instances and install distributed file system replication services. You don't need to keep these instances in public subnets, but in this lab setup, I'm going to keep them in public subnets because I can easily remote desktop them into using an internet connection. The ideal situation, if you create this one in your environment, you will create them in private subnets. So this is the high-level architecture. So let's get into different configurations and then learn how to create different architectural components step by step. In this section, we are going to learn how to configure the network so that you can create all other architectural component on top of it. So the first step is to create a virtual private cloud. So I'm going to give it a name as Fabricam. And for the CIDR block, I'm going to give 10.0.0.0.16. So I have created my VPC. And now I'm going to create 5 subnets. So first I'm going to create the private subnet in Fabricam. Address space is 10.0.0.1.0.24, and it's going to be in availability zone 1. Click create. And the next step is to create the second subnet. In this case, it's going to be private subnet 2 for the Fabricam, availability zone 2, 10.0.2.0.24 is the CIDR block. Create the third one. This is going to be a public subnet 1 for Fabricam, availability zone 1. I'm going to call it 3.0.24. Click create. Similarly, I'm going to create the other 2 remaining public subnets for the Fabricam. So this is going to be in availability zone 2. Address is going to be 4. Let's create. And finally, the last subnet is going to be public subnet 3 in the availability zone 3. And let's give it 10.0.5.0.24. So click create. And so once you create that, the next step is to create the routing table to route traffic across them. So select the VPC that you want to create. So this is going to be the private routing table, and then you are going to create a public routing table. So for the Fabricam, click create. So once I have these two routing tables, I'm going to create an internet gateway. So once I create the internet gateway, I'm going to attach into my virtual private cloud. So click attach. So go to your routing table and then define your routing so that you can route traffic. So for the public one, I'm going to create a route. In this case, all any traffic which is not bound to this VPC, I'm going to route to internet. And for the public subnet, I'm just going to keep it as it is. And then of course I want to associate the private subnets with the private one, and public subnets, in this case public subnets, with the public routing table. And I'm going to associate the private routing table with the private routing table. So private subnets goes to private routing table. So far so good. I have attached all the routings for my subnets. The next step is you can find that the subnet attachment. The next step is to create a directory service. In this case, I'm going to create a directory service using Microsoft Active Directory, which is a managed version of Active Directory in AWS. So go to AWS console and then select directory service. You can select different directory types. I'm going to select Microsoft Active Directory. Click setup directory. We're going to use a standard one. Call it fabricam.com. That's my domain name. NetBIOS name is Fabricam. So administrative password, this you need to remember, because if you don't have it, you cannot access this directory. Select which VPC that you want to create this into, and select the two private subnets that you have created. So these domain controllers will get provision into these two private subnets. Go for next step, and then click create to create the Active Directory. It takes about 30 minutes to create it. I just edited this video to fast forward it. So if you come after 30 minutes or 40 minutes, you will see this Active Directory provision very well. So now it's in active mode. So once it is active, you need to go to that and then select the two IP addresses of the DNS this Active Directory provides. So remember these two Active Directory IP addresses. So you need to go to your virtual private cloud and then create a DHCP option set and attach it. So any machine that is going inside this VPC will get its domain name from this DHCP configuration. So tell it fabricam.com. So I'm here creating a DHCP option set. Domain name servers is those IP addresses. NetBIOS servers also same, and the biotype is number 2. So click create. So I have created a DHCP option set. So once I create this DHCP option set, I'm going to attach that option set to my VPC. So it will not use the Amazon provided DNS servers. It will use Active Directory through this DHCP option set. So click edit, and you need to now select the DHCP option set that you just created. Click save. So far I have configured the Active Directory, and this network is now configured with the proper Active Directory. So next step is to create a distributed file system replication setup. So let's get started. The first thing is to spin up a few EC2 instances. So I'm going to use Microsoft Server Base Image 2016. Select image type, any instance size like T2 large is okay. So for the network, it's going to be Fabricam. So first replication one, I'm going to put into availability zone 1. I want to have internet access for that because I'm going to remote login into that. Select the domain that you want to join. That's a small mistake, but I will showcase you what happened, right? So in the security group, you need to enable security group. In this case, I'm giving RDP access. In a short while you realize that this RDP access along is not enough. Select the key that you want to select. So similarly, so now you spin up a new EC2 instance. Let's call it DFSR1. So that's going to be my distributed file system replication service 1. Similarly, you need to create 2 more EC2 instances. I'm not going to showcase you. So here I'm going to create 2 EC2 instances to install DFSR. So here I have 3 EC2 instances in 3 availability zones with Windows machine running, and I'm going to configure Windows distributed files system replication service on this. I'm going to remote login into this. I cannot as of now remote login into this using Active Directory credentials because of a mistake I did. So let's see what was the problem. So right now I'm logging into these machines using Amazon provided credentials instead of Active Directory provided credentials because the domain join failed. So if I go into this machine DFSR1, you can find that it is not domain join, although I say ask it to domain join. The reason why this failed to domain join was that it didn't have enough permission when I created the IAM role for that. So for example, let's try whether I can actually ping into that. So one common reason why it failed to domain join is that it cannot connect to the Active Directory. So if you ping into this Active Directory IP address, you can find the connection works. Let's ping into the next IP address also. The connection works, but for some reason, once I asked it to domain join, it failed to domain join. The reason is that it doesn't have EC2 system manager permissions for the role that I have assigned. If you select this one, you can find that they all belong into a role called DFSR EC2 instance role. So if you go into that, you can find that it doesn't have any permissions. So you need to attach a special permission that actually allows you to domain join the machine. So that's the permission that you want to have. There's a managed version of that permission set. Click attach. So if you start an EC2 instance now with this EC2 instance role, it will automatically domain join. So in case if you didn't get that in the first run, make sure that you do it. So just to showcase you, I'm going to create a test machine. This is just a test machine that I'm going to create. Just put it into any availability zone. But if you select this one as a fabricam.com and then see the DFSR role here, now this role has the permission to domain join. All right. So click next, 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 next. And after a while, once the instance starts, you can now log in with Active Directory credentials. You can find that the Active Directory credentials works. And if you go into the system, you can find that it is domain join. Right? So make sure that you have the right EC2 instance role with the correct permissions to log in. So far, I'm going to do is these machines are not domain joined, so I'm going to manually domain join them. That's also one option. You can do that bulk domain joining using EC2 System Manager. So in this case, I'm using the traditional approach to domain join all these machines into managed Active Directory. So here you need to provide the administrative password, username and password that you use when you created the AWS Managed Active Directory. So click OK and then restart the machine. And for all the other services, the same steps. I'm not going to showcase you how to do that. I'm just fast forwarding it. So you need to do it for the DFSR Server 2 and for the DFSR Server 3. So once you domain join these machines, you need to install some services. So now I'm in DFSR Server 1. They're all domain join. Go to Server Manager and then select Add New Services. Click Next. You need to enable certain services in this one. So you need to enable under the file replication, you need to enable these two Windows feature that allows you to do this file replication. So once you select these two services, it takes some time to install it. So for the DFSR 1 server, I like to have some Active Directory management capabilities. So I'm going to install that Active Directory management tools. So how AWS Managed Active Directory is managed if you want to configure it, for example, you can use the typical Active Directory management tools. So now I'm configuring this new directory distributed file system service, and of course you need to install the same applications for the DFSR server 2 and for the DFSR server 3. So this is a fast forward of that, so because it's a repetitive task that you will be doing. You can of course use PowerShell if you want to automate these processes. So once you install this one, the next step is to create a namespace. If you want to know more about what namespaces are, the best reference comes from MSDN articles. So you can read about what DFS namespace means, some concepts behind that. So make sure that you read the Microsoft articles to get to know how DFS really works. So the next step is, so I'm in DFSR server 1. If you go into DFS management, you can find that I have this page to create namespace. So I'm going to create a new namespace. So the server I'm going to select is, the first one is DFSR server 1. So that's the server that will manage this namespace. You can of course add multiple servers if you want. Click next, and so you need to give it a name. So the name is what distinguishes this from rest of the namespaces. So in this case I'm going to call it something like my data, that identifies the namespace. So once you do that, go next. So I'm not going to use standalone method of DFSR because I want to have some high availability. So I'm going to use Active Directory based DFSR configuration, and I select the first option and click create. So this will create the namespace that I want. So as of now, this namespace is backed by only one server. So if you want to add multiple servers, you can do. Remember, like when we install DFSR service, we install the namespace service also. So all our 3 servers has namespace service. So I can now add these extra servers to manage this namespace. So if one server goes down, the namespace will still be available. So I'm adding the DFS server 2. So if you try to do this, you will get an error message. The reason for this, sometimes you will come across this kind of errors, is that our security groups are not properly configured to allow certain traffic. So remember, when I created these EC2 instances, I created some security groups for them. But for some reason, these security groups are not properly configured. So you get this error. So let's try to ping into one of these EC2 instance DFSR2 from DFSR1 server. You can find that the ping does not work. It times out. So seems like there's a connection issue from DFSR server 1 to DFSR server 2. So if you find this kind of errors, the next thing you need to do is to look at the security groups. So you can find all these 3 servers belonging to one security group called RDP. Unfortunately, when I first configured it, it only allowed RDP access, which is pretty much TCP traffic. So what I'm going to do now is to change this RDP access security group to allow traffic in between these servers. So if I go into inbound traffic, so you can find it only allows RDP access. So I'm going to allow all traffic within this private network, so each EC2 instance can communicate with each other. Of course, in a proper production environment, you need to allow just enough firewall rules to access the DFSR. So if you refer to Microsoft documentation, you will know what ports need to open for DFSR to function. So far, so good. So now these EC2 instances can communicate with each other. So if I go into my DFSR server 1 and then try to ping into let's say DFSR server 2, you can find that the ping works. So the traffic now can flow. So DFSR 3 server, so I can connect. So now the traffic flows fine in the way that I wanted. So let's now try to add more namespace servers into this. So click add namespace servers. In this case, you can add DFSR server 2. So it works fine. Click OK. So click OK. And it will now communicate with the server 2, and this communication will work fine because the traffic flows in the way you want. And after a while, this DFSR server 2 will appear in the namespace. So I'm going to add another server. Of course, you don't need to add all your replication servers to as namespace servers. Namespace servers can be different from replication servers. Usually that's the case in production environment. But here I'm going to showcase you that namespace server and the replication servers can be on the same machine so as well. So I'm here adding the server 2. So if you go into your namespace, you will find 3 namespace servers that manage this namespace. So that's a good way to keep highly available namespace servers. So once you configure the namespace, the next thing you need to do, you will see that if you go into DFSR server 2, you will find that it has created a new folder, and you can find that it has provided some permissions. So sometimes you will find that hey, the DFSR doesn't have permissions to write into these folders, and it could be due to these folder permission issues. So these are automatically created folders. So you have configured this namespace. Next thing is to configure the replication group. That also you need to do through DFS management console, or you can do it with PowerShell. So to create a replication group, go to replication and create a new replication group. You need to select this one, and for the name you can just give my replication group. So after that, click next. You need to add which servers participate in this replication. So in this case, I'm going to specify the 2 additional servers, DFSR 2 and DFSR 3. And so you need to add all the servers that are going to be member of this configuration. So once you add the servers that will do your replication, so you need to add all the servers that will participate in this replication, DFSR 1, 2, 3. So if you have multiple servers, you can do that. Usually, if you want to do this in PowerShell, you can do it in PowerShell as well. So once you added these 3 servers, the next step is to define the topology. So in this case, I'm going to use hub and spoke topology. So this topology you can use to, for example, to distribute backups from central location to some disaster recoverable sites. Maybe you want to distribute a software across your branch offices, so that's a good way to do that. So now you need to select which one is going to be the hub and which node's going to be the spoke. So I'm going to have DFSR 1 as the hub 1. So once you configure this, you will find that you can configure the which folders are being used in a different one, and also you can define for the nodes which nodes act as the hub. You can define the bandwidth limits. In this case, I don't have, especially if you have a slow internet connection or slow network, you will end up creating different bandwidths to distribute files. So once you configure this, you can configure, for example, what kind of local paths that you want to do. In this case, I'm going to define a separate path So in the DFSR one, so I'm going to create a new folder called let's say you can give it something like a software folder. So this is a folder that I'm going to distribute software, right, to all my branch offices. So inside that I'm going to create a one called install. So I'll copy this file path. So this is what you are going to replicate into your branch offices. So select that and then click OK. So this all the content of this folder is going to get replicated into branch offices, and define like where they will end up in the branch offices. So you can define a different folder path if you want. It doesn't need to be the same. To give an idea, like in this case, instead of using the same folder path in the DFSR2, I'm going to define a different folder path. So to do that, what you need to do is to select this, and you can create a folder in the DFSR2 from here itself. So you can browse into that, and instead of creating in the same folder structure, I'm going to create it in something like let's call DFSR2 data folder, right? So you create this. So for the DFSR3 also you can create a different folder if you like. As I mentioned earlier, they don't need to be same name. Especially if you have different drivers with different storage, you can define where you want to save these files. So I have created this replication job. So that will start replicating if you have any content already. So that's the topology of this structure, of this configuration. If you go into the connection, you can see how the replication is going to happen, which one is going to copy files into which one. So because we created a hub and spoke configuration, you can find that spoke DFSR2 and 3 is going to send data to DFSR1. So let's now do some testing. So I'm going to copy a file into DFSR1 and then see how that file get replicated into the other environments. So here I have like 3 servers side by side. So in the install folder, software 1, I'm going to create a new file. So create a new file, call it some data. So you can find that it's near real-time changes into this one. So if you add some content into this, let's call data from DFSR1 or like DFSR1. And from the time that you save it, all those changes that you made will appear on this new file. You can find that the file got replicated very quickly. So hope you enjoy this session and learn how to configure a Microsoft Distributed File System Replication Service on AWS environment with Managed Active Directory.